Hello everyone, Max here from Evidence-Based Football Manager. This is part 4 of my Matchday mechanics video series for FM24. Today we're going to talk about match sharpness. Match sharpness is a parameter that ranges between 0 to 10,000, but in the game match sharpness doesn't actually drop below 5,000. So 10,000 is the highest value that a match sharpness can get in the game, and 5,000 is the lowest that it can get. Match sharpness is represented in the game with these icons that are green colored when match sharpness is full and red colored when match sharpness is at its lowest level. Match sharpness is slowly lost when players are not playing any matches and builds up after playing a match. I'll break this video down into 3 parts. First, I'll talk about how the level of match sharpness affects the performance and the injury risk of your players in FM24. Secondly, I'll show you how match sharpness is gained during a match in FM24. And lastly, I'll talk about how match sharpness is lost on non-match days. Okay, let's start talking about the effects of match sharpness on player performance and injury risk. As always, I use my TestCop save file to run repeated trials when the level of match sharpness of Team A players were set at various levels between 100% to 50%. Every time I changed the match sharpness of players, I ran 1,000 repeated trials so that I could compare Team A's win rate from those trials. I also counted the number of injuries sustained by players of Team A. And let's take a look at the results. So I have a line graph here that compares the percentage of Team A wins, draws, and Team B wins as I change the level of match sharpness of Team A players. In all these experiments, Team B's match sharpness was held constant at 100%. It was just Team A's match sharpness that I varied. And you can see that when Team A's match sharpness was set as 50%, they just got absolutely dominated by Team B. So here, Team A won just 33 out of 1,000 matches. As I increased Team A's match sharpness, the rate of win also went up for Team A. For example, when Team A's match sharpness was set as 80%, they won around 20% of the time. And when Team A's match sharpness was set as 90%, they won 27% of the time. But even when Team A's match sharpness was set as 90%, Team A was still being outperformed by Team B by a substantial margin, since here, Team B won 49% of the time. So you can tell that match sharpness really affects the performance of players in Football Manager to a substantial degree. Even a 10% difference in match sharpness between your team and the opposition team will generate a substantial gap in performance, as you can see from these results. So you really want your players' match sharpness to be at least on par with the average match sharpness of your opponents if you don't want your players to be outperformed by the opposition team. Next, let's take a look at this graph here, which shows you the number of injuries sustained by Team A players during the Test Cup trials. I separated injuries into 2 different types. Light injuries are injuries that allow the player to continue playing and finish the match, whereas heavy injuries are those that require immediate substitutions. So when Team A's match sharpness was set as 100%, the players sustained 105 light injuries and 78 heavy injuries from 1,000 trials. When match sharpness was set to values lower than 100%, both light and heavy injuries went up for Team A players. For example, when Team A's match sharpness was set as 80%, players sustained 126 light injuries and 87 heavy injuries. Whereas when match sharpness was set as 50%, players sustained 257 light injuries and 108 heavy injuries, which is a lot higher than when match sharpness was set as higher values. So as you can see from this graph, match sharpness not only affects player performance, but it increases their injury risk as well. So guys, match sharpness does matter. It affects both performance and injury risk of your players in FM24. So do make sure that match sharpness of your players is always maintained as high as possible in your Football Manager saves. Alright, let's move on to the second part of this video and talk about how match sharpness is gained during a match in FM24. I used my TestCop save file again to record the amount of match sharpness gained by Team A players from the TestCop match, and I tried changing a range of variables in the game to find out whether they affect the amount of match sharpness gain. The basic rule of match sharpness gain is that the amount of match sharpness gained by a player during a match is proportional to the number of minutes played in that match, rounded up or down to the nearest tens of minutes. For example, if a player has played 79 minutes in a match, it will be rounded up to 80 minutes, and the player will gain 8% match sharpness from that match. If a player has played 74 minutes of football, it will be rounded down to 70 minutes, and the player will gain 7% match sharpness from that match. I'm going to call this rule the rounded minute rule because the number of minutes are rounded up or down to determine the amount of match sharpness gain. There are other modifiers in the game that are applied on top of the rounded minute rule to arrive at the final amount of match sharpness gain. But yeah, the rounded minute rule is the primary rule in deciding the amount of match sharpness gain for players in FM24. I tried changing a range of variables in the game to see if they affect the amount of match sharpness gain. The variables that I tested include competition reputation, reputation of the opposition team, the level of player fatigue, level of player OPC, level of match sharpness of the players prior to the match, the natural fitness attribute of players, and lastly, player morale. Out of all these variables that I tested, only one of them affected the amount of match sharpness gain, which is the level of match sharpness of the player prior to the match. Let's take a look at this bar graph here, which will help me explain. So this graph shows you the amount of match sharpness gained by a player who's played a 90-minute full-time test cup match as I try changing all these different types of variables. As you can see, the only variable in this graph that affected the amount of match sharpness gain was the level of match sharpness of the player prior to the test cup match. For example, when match sharpness was set between 50 to 65%, players gained 9% match sharpness from the test cup match, which is in accordance with the rounded minute rule that I told you about earlier. Remember, according to the rounded minute rule, a 90-minute playing time will translate into 9% match sharpness gain. However, as I increased the level of pre-match match sharpness of these players, the amount of match sharpness gain became smaller and smaller. When pre-match match sharpness was set as 90%, players only gained 2% match sharpness from the test cup match. So yeah, when match sharpness is lower, it will be gained relatively faster, whereas when match sharpness is higher, additional gain will be relatively slower. None of these other variables that I tested had an effect on the amount of match sharpness gain. Competition reputation didn't matter, the reputation of the opposition team didn't matter, the level of fatigue or the level of OPC of Team A players didn't matter, the natural fitness attribute didn't matter, and lastly, player morale also didn't matter for match sharpness gain. I conducted a similar test using a friendly match instead of the test cup match, and the amount of match sharpness gain from the friendly match was a little bit different. The amount of match sharpness gain from a friendly was lower than the amount of gain from the test cup match, which is considered a competitive match. Now, I don't think the fact that friendlies lead to less match sharpness gain is due to the reputation of the friendly match being lower than the test cup match. Remember, I told you just now that the reputation of the competition in Football Manager has no impact on the amount of match sharpness gain. I just think that the game uses a different formula to calculate the amount of match sharpness gain from friendly matches. I couldn't quite figure out the exact formula that determines the amount of match sharpness gain from friendly matches. I did some tests using my test cup save file, and I did notice that match sharpness gain from friendly matches is still proportional to the number of minutes played. Although I couldn't come up with a nice formula that represents that proportional relationship between friendly matches and match sharpness gain. I think it's enough to say at this point that match sharpness gain from friendly matches in Football Manager is proportional to the number of minutes played, just like competitive matches. Although the overall amount of match sharpness gain from friendlies will be lower compared to the amount of match sharpness that's gained from competitive matches. Now, I believe there does exist one more variable in the game that I haven't tested that can also modify the amount of match sharpness gain in FM24. I've done some simulations using my Leicester City save file, and I found that the amount of match sharpness that was gained by my Leicester City players wasn't quite what I expected using the rounded minute rule that I talked about earlier. Let's take a look at this table here, for example. So this table shows you the amount of match sharpness that was gained by my Leicester City players from a Premier League match against West Ham. And while the majority of these players conformed to the rounded minute rule, some of these players gained more match sharpness than I anticipated. For example, Pablo Maffio here has played 90 minutes in the match against West Ham, which translates into 9% match sharpness gain. Luke Thomas here has played 79 minutes, which is rounded up to 80 minutes, so that translates into 8% match sharpness gain from the match. So the amount of match sharpness gained by these players were in accordance with the rounded minute rule. But for players like Noah Atubolu here and Leonidas Sturgio, they played 90 minutes, and somehow they've gained 11% match sharpness, which is more than the amount that is predicted using the rounded minute rule. So yeah, with some of these players, the amount of match sharpness gained from the match against West Ham didn't quite align with the rounded minute rule. I don't have any explanations for this. My guess is that it's got something to do with the amount of recent match load of these players. Obviously in this Leicester City save file, all these players that you're seeing would have varying degrees of recent match load, which could affect the amount of match sharpness gain. But that's just a guess at this stage. If you guys have any bright ideas as to what other factors in the game could be influencing the amount of match sharpness gain, do tell me in the comment section and I will take a look into it. Alright, let's move on to the third part of this video and talk about the loss of match sharpness. Remember, match sharpness is something that's gained during a match and lost slowly on non-match days. I used the test cup save file to progress the game for 8 days when no matches were held, so that I could observe the amount of match sharpness that was lost by players of Team A during those 8-day period. No training was held for 8 days, so the training schedule of Team A was filled only with rest sessions for 8 straight days. The most important rule about match sharpness loss is that the amount of loss is inversely proportional to a player's recent match exposure. A player who spent more minutes on the field recently will be able to better retain his match sharpness, whereas a player who spent less minutes on the field recently will lose his match sharpness relatively quicker. I'll get you to take a look at this table here, which shows you the level of match sharpness of the players from my test cup save file over our 8-day observation period. I have a list of players here who have all had varying amounts of playing time, all the way from 0, which means the player didn't feature in the test cup match, to 90 minutes, which means the players played a 90-minute full-time match. And you can see that players who played more number of minutes in the test cup match retained their match sharpness for a longer period of time, while players who played less number of minutes lost their match sharpness by greater amounts over the observation period. For example, if you take a look at this guy here, so he's played 77 minutes of the test cup match, and his match sharpness went from 10,000 to 9,540 by the end of the observation period. Whereas this guy here, he's played 16 minutes of the test cup match, and his match sharpness went from 10,000 to 8,880 in the same period. So this guy has lost his match sharpness by a greater amount compared to other players who played more number of minutes. And if you look carefully at these values of match sharpness, you'll be able to see that there are changes in match sharpness every time playing time goes up by 10 minutes. Players who played between 60 to 70 minutes are treated as being in the same block of playing time, so they all ended up with the same level of match sharpness by the end of the observation period. Players who played between 20 to 30 minutes, they are treated as being in the same block of playing time, so they all ended up with the same level of match sharpness by the end of the 8-day observation period. Now, when I say that match sharpness loss is related to the amount of recent match exposure of players, I don't know how far back the game goes to calculate the amount of match load. Is it like 5 most recent matches? Is it 30 most recent days? Is it like one calendar month? I couldn't tell for sure. It was something that I couldn't really test using my test cup save file. Just keep in mind that a player needs to be exposed to healthy amounts of football in your Football Manager saves if you want your players to prevent the loss of his match sharpness as much as possible. I also tried testing a range of other variables in the game that I thought might affect the amount of match sharpness loss. The variables that I tested include the player's level of OPC, the level of fatigue, the level of match sharpness before any loss takes place, the natural fitness attribute, the quality of the physios hired by the club, and lastly, the sports scientists hired by the club. I picked one player from the Test Cup save file who played 60 minutes of the Test Cup match, and I tried changing different variables to see if they affected the amount of match sharpness that was lost following the Test Cup match. The reason I chose this player who played 60 minutes of football is because, as I said before, less playing time means greater amounts of match sharpness loss, so it makes it easier for me to detect changes in the amount of match sharpness loss as I try changing different types of variables. There were two variables that I tested that affected the amount of match sharpness loss. Those two variables are the natural fitness attribute of the player and also the physio that's hired by the club. Let's take a look at this line graph here, which will help me explain. So this graph shows you the level of match sharpness of the player that we're observing over an 8-day period following the Test Cup match. There are a few lines here in the center that are overlapping with one another. So these are the variables that had no impact on the amount of match sharpness loss. This line that you're seeing here is when the natural fitness attribute of the player was set as 20 out of 20. In the control, natural fitness was set as 10 out of 20 for the player that we're observing. And you can see here that the loss of match sharpness over the observation period has slowed down a little bit when natural fitness was set as 20 out of 20. In the control, the player's match sharpness was 8,880 by the end of the observation period, but when natural fitness was set as 20 out of 20, the player's match sharpness ended up at 8,950, which is a little bit better than the control, when natural fitness was set as 10 out of 20. On the other hand, when natural fitness was set as 1 out of 20, the player has lost more match sharpness compared to the control. So this is a line that represents a scenario when natural fitness was set as 1 out of 20, and the player's match sharpness at the end of the testing period was 8,817, which is slightly lower than the control. So whether natural fitness was set as 1 out of 20 or 20 out of 20, the difference in the loss of match sharpness was about 130 points, which in the game it translates to about 1.3% of match sharpness, which is admittedly not much. But hey, when the season is busy, when you're playing Football Manager, every little bit of match sharpness counts. This line that you're seeing here is the scenario when physios were hired by the club. In the control, there was no medical staff for in Team A, no physios and no sports scientists as well. Actually, there are three lines that are overlapping here. The first line is when one physio was hired by the club who had 1 in all attributes. The second line is when one physio was hired by the club and he had 20 out of 20 in all attributes. And the third line is when 3 physios were hired by the club who had 20 out of 20 in all attributes. And all three of these lines ended up with 9,125 match sharpness by the end of the observation period, which means the player was able to retain more match sharpness with the help of a physio. Since one physio with 1 out of 20 in all attributes was enough to create a difference in the amount of match sharpness, it means that when you play Football Manager, all you need is to just have one physio in the team. And it doesn't have to be of anyone of quality. Just have someone in the medical team and it will help your players retain more match sharpness on non-match days. Other than the natural fitness attribute and the presence of a physio, no other variables that I tested affected the amount of match sharpness that was lost on non-match days. The player's level of OPC didn't change anything, the level of fatigue didn't change anything, and also the level of match sharpness didn't change anything. this is the line that shows you how match sharpness changed when it started at 70% at the start of the observation period instead of starting at 100%. So this entire line has been moved downwards, but the amount of loss per day over the 8-day observation period was the same, which means that the current level of match sharpness has no impact on the rate of match sharpness loss. And lastly, having a sports scientist didn't affect the amount of match sharpness loss for the player that we observed. Now, I am aware that there is one more important variable in the game that I haven't tested in this video that can also affect match sharpness, and that is the type of training session that is held on non-match days. In the experiments that I showed you today, the players didn't do any training. I deliberately fill this training schedule only with rest sessions because I wanted to control my experiments as much as possible. But the type of training sessions that are held on non-match days will most likely have an influence on the player's match sharpness. I have done some preliminary testing regarding the relationship between training and match sharpness, but I've decided not to cover it in this video because 1, it's a massive topic that deserves a whole video on its own, and 2, I might have bumped into some glitches in the game related to training and match sharpness, so I do want to investigate it a little bit further before I publish the results in my video. So yeah, I didn't talk about the different types of training sessions in this video, but training is most likely another big factor that can also affect the amount of match sharpness that is lost on non-match days. I will do a separate video in the future to investigate the relationship between training and match sharpness. Okay folks, time to do a summary of the video. 1. Match sharpness is a parameter that ranges between 0 to 10,000, but in the game, match sharpness doesn't actually fall below 5,000. Match sharpness is represented in the game with these icons that are green colored when match sharpness is full and red colored when match sharpness is at its lowest level. 2. Match sharpness affects the performance of your players. Your players will be outperformed by the opposition team if match sharpness of your players is even just 10% lower than the opposition. So do make sure that your players' match sharpness is at least on par with the match sharpness of the opposition team. 3. Match sharpness affects the injury risk of your players. When match sharpness is low, injury risk of your players will go up. So again, do make sure that match sharpness of your players is maintained as high as possible. 4. Match sharpness is gained by playing a match. The basic rule of match sharpness gain is what I'm calling the rounded minute rule. The number of minutes played are rounded either up or down to the nearest tens of minutes, which is then translated into the amount of match sharpness gain. 5. On top of the rounded minute rule, a player's current level of match sharpness will also affect the amount of match sharpness gain. The lower the current match sharpness, the greater the amount of gain, and the higher the current level of match sharpness, the smaller the amount of gain. 6. Friendly matches lead to lower match sharpness gain compared to competitive matches. The amount of match sharpness gain from friendly matches is still proportional to the number of minutes played, although I can't pinpoint the exact formula that governs the amount of match sharpness gain from friendly matches. 7. There seems to be one more factor in the game that can also affect the amount of match sharpness gain, which I couldn't quite figure out in making this video. So the exact amount of match sharpness gain for some players in your actual Football Manager saves will deviate slightly from the rounded minute rule. 8. Match sharpness is lost slowly on non-match days. There are 3 variables that I tested that can affect the amount of match sharpness loss: the amount of recent match exposure of a player, the natural fitness attribute of the player, and lastly, the presence of a physio at the club. A player with high amounts of recent match exposure will be able to retain his match sharpness better on non-match days. Also, a player with high natural fitness attribute will be able to retain his match sharpness better on non-match days. Having a physio working at the club will also help players retain their match sharpness. One physio is enough, regardless of the quality. Just having any physio at the club is enough to create a benefit. Alright folks, that's it for today's video. As always, if you have any feedbacks or questions, leave them in the comment section below and I will take a look at them. This Matchday Mechanics video series for FM24 will be continued. Alright guys, thanks for watching. See you.